at the end for Q&A. So on to today's content. We will be shortly introducing Ollie Frith from Crisis Prevention Institute. He's the head of training at CPI. Ollie delivers a lot of training through behaviour, teacher as performer, and restorative approaches and learner engagement strategies. He's calling us from the UK this morning, and it's measly 5:37 a.m. He's had a touch over 15 years working in challenging schools and brings a wealth of knowledge on this subject, so we're very excited. I think one of the things that makes it quite interesting is the exposure to diverse educational settings that Ollie has brought with him. He's touched many different learning environments and students, from what he described as highly motivated to the most challenging and layered, which I think is an interesting description of some students that he's dealt with. Just in terms of the presentation, we'll be bringing up the slideshow along the way, so please do pop your questions up as we're going. In terms of who we are, for those that you don't know, EduHealth Solutions is built towards building healthy and happy schools. We do a lot of stuff in enrolment strategy, student and staff wellbeing, and sustainability in the classroom and school community. Today's topic will cover on the aspects of culture that I mentioned. We did have this inside the registration, so you probably saw a little bit of a flavour on what we're aiming to cover today. And then a little bit about CPI. I've shuffled this a little bit as we wait for Ollie to arrive to his office. He does apologise in advance for his traffic issues. We do have Fiona Patterson from CPI on the call, and Fiona's going to tell us a little bit about CPI just while we get Ollie online. Are you there, Fiona? We can't hear you, Fiona. Sorry, mate. You've got no audio there.
Okay, better?
Hey.
Yay! See, technology, Fiona, not friends.
There we go, we got there.
Especially not today. So, sorry guys, apologies for the delay in getting started this morning beyond technology. It's they've had a time change in the UK literally over the weekend. So when Ollie checked to see what time 3:30 p.m. in Australia was yesterday, it was 5:30 in the morning. Unfortunately, now it's 4:44 in the morning and he's on his way to the office, so he shouldn't be too far away. What I'll do in the meantime is just give you a quick update on who CPI is and what we're about. CPI has been in business for 40 years this year, and CPI stands for Crisis Prevention Institute. So we've had a long history with providing training to organisations to help them to manage challenging behaviour in a number of different settings, including education, but also healthcare, disability service providers, aged care, and various other organisations, including lots of government organisations. From an education perspective in Australia and New Zealand, we deal with a number of the major state-based organisations in New South Wales, in South Australia, in Queensland, and in the Northern Territory, and a number of Catholic dioceses across the country. In New Zealand, we're also affiliated with the Ministry of Education. So we've got a really strong focus, and that's what I wanted to point out. We have a really strong focus on education as part of our business. And what Ollie's going to come along and do today is talk a little bit about our education offering through Pivotal Education. So some of you may have heard of Pivotal before. It's a business that's existed for about 15 years now, and one that was acquired by CPI about 2.5 years ago. Ollie has a very long history in delivering training, and the thing that I like most about the Pivotal training is that it really talks about whole of school change and cultural change, so that you know, we recognise the best behaviour in our students, and we talk about, you know, how to manage challenging behaviour in a classroom environment. The key aspect to Pivotal Education and part of the program that Ollie will go through today is really this concept of when adults change their behaviour, the behaviour of the students changes as well. So it's very much focused on that. As I said earlier, we've been offering training to education for quite a number of years, and that's been through our MAPA, or Management of Actual and Potential Aggression program. It's used extensively throughout the state. So If you have any questions for me, I guess, on what CPI is or the types of programs that we provide, I'm happy to answer those now, or happy to kind of wait till the end when Ollie's run through it a little bit more. Matt, was there anything else that you wanted me to cover?
Look, I think maybe hearing a little bit more about the MAPA program would be useful. It sounds like there's a good framework there that we can talk to. I see some segue with some of the content Ollie's going to be presenting later.
Yeah, I can do that, absolutely. So MAPA, as I said just before, stands for the Management of Actual and Potential Aggression. It's a course that's very much focused on the de-escalation and of behaviour, of challenging behaviour, whether that's with a student or a child or an adult. And it's very much focused on recognising where the stages of escalation, behavioural escalation are, and how we respond to those stages as a person that's facing that, that type of challenging behaviour. Hi, Ollie. So just to quickly finish off MAPA before we let Ollie get started, it's a 10-unit course. 8 of the 10 units are focused on de-escalation. So as I said, very heavy focus on de-escalation, as well as the 2 remaining units having some practical skills on how to manage behaviour should it, result in needing to be managed. What I'll do is I'll hand over to Ollie now that he's guys.
Thanks, Fiona.
So get my slide deck open because I think that's probably going to be the best options. So how long have I got, Matt? Just give me a time frame to what time do you want me to end at?
Oh, look, I think it's 10 to now. So if we plug away for half an hour, 35 minutes, then we can have some Q&A at the end.
Fantastic.
I'll jump in with questions as they arise because it'll probably be topical to that slide.
Okay, no problem. So yeah, so 35 minutes. My name's Ollie Frith. I'm the head of training at the education arm in the UK for CPI International. And for a number of years, we've been working on how to support schools to develop the culture of behaviour management, but more than that, really looking at the culture of the school and how the relational approach really influences young people's behaviour, to correct behaviour, to influence behaviour, to maintain boundaries, to really support the culture in the organisation. So in terms of what I'm going to be talking about as efficiently as possible, there's a brief overview, and I won't run through, but I'll touch on these salient points in terms of how each organisation can really support the culture shift. And it's not away from something to something else necessarily, but it's certainly about identifying what does the culture in your school look like? What does the culture in the classroom look like? The corridors, in the yard? And how does that influence behaviour across the board? And when we look at how to influence behaviour and culture, we need to understand why is it important? And for me and my perspective, it's all about that sense of togetherness, that deep sense of belonging that all young people and staff members alike and families and any visitor and any stakeholder involved in the organisation absolutely feels the need to be connected. And if we build a culture that supports this, that encourages that sense of pride, and not only does it encourage it, but the culture recognises the things that currently are going on that accidentally sabotage those connections. We need to be able to focus on accountability and responsibility in the sense that it's a madness for me as a professional to say to a child, you need to take responsibility for your behaviour, unless I'm absolutely certain that I am modelling that sense of accountability, that I'm demonstrating what it looks like to take responsibility. So if I'm shouting aggressively at a child because they've behaved disrespectfully, then that's a contradiction. That essentially says to that young person, you get to behave badly when you're important like me. And until that time, you sit down, you shut up, you do as you're told. You follow the rules. You sit in this sort of sense of conformity. And I'm not sure that's a healthy message. If we want young people to fully take responsibility for their behavior choices, then they have to understand why they're doing it. And that's why it comes back to that sense of connectedness to the organization. Because I don't want young people in my classroom to behave themselves because they're afraid of me or they're afraid of the consequence. I want them to behave themselves because it's the right thing to do. And so when we talk about expectations in school cultures, that's what I really mean is my expectation is something that I'm modeling. It's not to do as I say, not as I do, but it's certainly I am the demonstration, the advocate of this is what it looks like here. And I think when we look at school cultures across the board, and certainly in Australia, and I know that different states still have different expectations and rules around things like corporal punishment. And in the last 20 years, there's a changing conversation around why should we look at addressing this. 20, 30, 40 years ago, behavior management was very much a response to inappropriate behaviors. And those responses, if we look through all punishments or consequences or sanctions historically in our school cultures, I'm not sure any of them actually work. They serve as deterrent. And you will know just as well as I do that the very young people that we're talking about when we talk about challenging distress behaviors, well, they're undeterred by the deterrence. And so therefore, we've just got this consequence system in place, or this behavior response system in place, should I say, that is serving as well, we've got to have something, and it's what we've always done. And so what I'm interested in looking at in terms of shifting school cultures in a direction that really supports these things, that aims to get to that stage where we as a school community can say, this is how we do it here. There's an act of celebration around the connectedness and the belonging to the culture of the school. This isn't about CPI saying, do it the CPI way. This is very much around each individual school saying, this is our way. And we've got some ideas and suggestions and some training that can support that. But ultimately, schools need to create their own sense of culture, that this is us. And if we look at this slide here, prevention is better than cure. If we can put in place a solid and robust culture that helps reduce and prevent incidences from occurring, well, that's far better, surely, than having an incident response. And if we look at this chart, we've got typical crisis behaviors where young people lose control, if we take that as the definition. And programs traditionally would be around starting at the de-escalation phase and then obviously the response to those crisis behaviors. But there's a whole host earlier on of school culture that isn't just about those high tariff learners. It isn't just about the extreme behaviors that cause the most challenge to schools. Yes, of course, we have to have a reasonable and proportionate response to those behaviors. We're not going to eradicate those because those behaviors come from all sorts of avenues that aren't just about whether the school culture is right or not. But actually, if we focus on preventing and reducing, we can really start to look at that culture with routines, habits, relationships, that sense of belonging, pride, and accountability that flows all the way through the culture, right from the moment young people join your school, all the way through to if they do display those extreme behaviors. And I think we need to start really looking at how we understand where those extreme behaviors come from. And again, we talk about the constant low-level disruption stuff all the way through to behaviors that come from extreme trauma or adverse childhood experiences. And there's a continuum of behavior influence, but also there's a continuum of behaviors. And the school culture needs to very much be around an inclusivity, a culture that says that we're supporting everyone. Traditionally, when I read through behavior policies, when I talk about behavior systems, historically schools have been about, this is how we respond to challenging behavior or difficult behavior. And I want to know, when the young people who come to school, who are coming to school well uniformed, they're polite, they're on task, they do the work, when do they get their recognition? When do they get their support? And the school culture of behavior recognition needs to be all-encompassing. I know we've got a number of case studies for where MAPA and CPI has delivered programs in schools in Australia already. And if we go back, sorry, to the de-escalate and respond phase, the case studies are already looking at reducing huge amounts of behavior instances, improving the quality of the way in which schools are set up and prepared to respond to those extreme behaviors and before. But every teacher that ever says to me, here's an example of a behavior, how should I have dealt with it? My response is always the same. And if that's your starting point, then you're too late almost, because no behavior expert in the world is going to be able to come and fix behavior with a response. And that's why it goes back to the positive cultures that we can frame and build our responses upon. Because if we don't have those foundations, then the response is we're just chasing our tails. But the fact that we've got these case studies is fantastic. So, I mean, the framework that our training can give is very much around creating that consistency, that understanding of behavior, where we do need to de-escalate, we do need to upskill staff to be confident and assertive to be able to manage those behaviors. But ultimately, it still needs to come before this. We still need to be able to support staff in developing that positive culture, so everyone's on the same page, because I want every colleague of mine in the classroom next to me, in the classroom down the corridor, looking and walking in the same direction. I want every colleague to be able to know exactly, this is how we do it here. This is the culture of our school way. And so for me, way before we get to the conversation around de-escalation or crisis response, we need to talk about adult behavior. We need to talk about how we present ourselves as the experienced human beings, as the professionals, as the people who should be best placed to be able to regulate our responses. And consistency is something that we all talk about in schools quite a lot. We need to be more consistent, we say. That they are not consistent enough. But actually, what are we doing to develop that consistency? What are we truly doing to create that sense of consistency that's visible in our school cultures? That's audible around the corridors and the classrooms, that the young people absolutely and clearly feel and sense that sense of consistency. And the calm adult behavior that we need to apply really has to be that starting point, because I actually can't control anyone else's behavior. I can influence, I can ask, I can plead, I can suggest, I can bully, I could chastise, I could berate. But ultimately, sorry, that's my phone alarm. Ultimately, all I can do is control my own behavior. And become a model, an exemplar of behavior management. Because I don't think behavior management is about managing other people's behavior. I think behavior management is about both managing our own behavior and in turn providing an environment that supports young people to learn how to manage their own behavior. And so when we talk about culture, these are the 5 principles I'm going to talk you through. The first one being calm, consistent behavior. And then once we get that right, when we get all the adults on board to be able to self-reflect, to be able to consider their own responses, then we can build a culture around first attention for best conduct, which is about flipping the narrative. Instead of noticing the behaviors you don't want, let's focus on the behaviors that we do. You will get more of the behavior that you notice the most. And if we find ourselves noticing behaviors that are inappropriate or unacceptable or undesirable, then what we're teaching our students is that if you want my attention, then you do the wrong thing. You get my attention like that. If you want my attention, if you're sitting there and you need me to notice you, all you've got to do is play the fool, is play the clown, and I will notice you. Now, I'm not saying we should ignore these behaviors, but we don't give our first attention. My first attention goes to the behaviors that deserve it the most. The learners who are on point, on task, who are focused. I will say, thank you, you're incredible, you're doing a great job, well done, as I'll work the room, and eventually I'll land on the learner who's behaving inappropriately, and quietly and discreetly I might say, can we have a word? But not first. I want to save my energies for the learners that absolutely deserve it. And there's an effort there. It's counterintuitive, but often what's the most intuitive response isn't the most helpful one. Now, we also need to talk about routines, and we need to be relentless about it, because we need to talk about how we build habitual behaviors in our school culture that really support the efficacy of that culture. And this is how we do things here. The keystone routines where all staff come together in a visible way, to the point where your learners need to notice something's changed, something's shifted. What's going on? Have you been on a course? We need them to ask us, because we need them to see those routines in place. It might be the routine for how you enter a classroom space. Imagine that in your school. Every single classroom had the same key routine about how young people enter the classroom space. Now, that's an interesting one, because if you're a learner and you've got to go, particularly in high school, where you're going to a number of different learning spaces throughout the day, and you've got to learn different routines for different adults, that becomes complicated. And if we have the same routine for entering a classroom space, or the end and send, the leaving the classroom space, or maybe walking in the corridors, or maybe the way we transition from learning time to home time, you agree some key routines that are celebrated across the school. And what we do is we create that consistency. We create that visible sense of togetherness that communicate those expectations in our school environment. We do also need to have a plan for what we're going to say. I think too often in schools, adults respond to low-level disruptive behaviors without a plan. Or rather, the plan is, I'm going to stop these behaviors, and that's it. That's the plan. I'm going to stop it. Well, in my experience, that doesn't always go to plan. I say that needs to stop, the learner pushes back. They show me some secondary behaviors. They might escalate their behaviors. And now I've got a problem, because do I deal with the primary behavior, or do I deal with the escalation? Of course, we focus on the most problematic behaviors. And often in situations that start off with low-level disruption, escalate very quickly, and the adult just says, well, I only asked them to take their coat off, and it all blew up. And if we have a plan, if we have a script, I'm not talking about we learn a script across the board and we all just become robots or automatrons. You know, I actually want professionals to be creative and autonomous in their decision making. But we need to have a structure for responding to inappropriate behaviors. And if we have a clear, consistent script, then actually that allows me to strip away my emotional response, because my emotions have absolutely no place in the conversation when dealing with difficult behaviors. It's not about me. It's not about how it makes me feel. It's about the learner's choice and the learner choosing that behavior and being made aware of that choice, and then being made aware of the consequence that's attached to those behaviors, that essentially they are choosing that consequence. It's not about me. It's not me wearing a target that says, your behavior makes me feel like this. And if I've got a certain script that allows me to fall back on, then that massively supports me as a professional and all my colleagues to be able to eliminate those emotional responses. And then finally, the fifth principle of practice for shifting culture is about restorative approaches. But let me be really clear about this, because lots of schools, certainly in the UK, have got excited about the idea of restorative practice, and they've removed all punitive sanctions. They've got rid of detention, they've got rid of exclusion, and they've said, instead of that, we're going to have restorative conversations. And my advice is, whoa, slow down. This isn't about replacing detention or punitive sanctions. Restorative approaches should be about, in fact, all of those first four principles are around restorative practice. It's about the relational approach, but you cannot repair a relationship unless you've built a relationship. And so what we want to do is to support schools in being able to clearly identify how not only can we build relationships more effectively, but what are we doing that accidentally sabotage those relationships, and how can we eliminate that sabotage? Because the restorative approaches bit, it comes in naturally and it grows. And we actually get to a point where we haven't got rid of our sanctions. We just don't need to use them. We've made them redundant because we've created a positive and effective culture that supports all of these principles, but supports that relational approach and that pride and belonging that I mentioned, that helps young people connect. And therefore, the more connected they are to the school culture, we reduce the chance that they're going to try and sabotage or damage that school culture. But clearly, this isn't magic stuff. This isn't going to just revolutionize school cultures so there's no inappropriate behavior. We are still going to have those difficult behaviors. but we build our response on the foundations of that school culture with these principles that really help everyone involved, young people, staff members, and everyone in the community, to feel that deep connection to that school environment. So I'll come back to this slide, and what I want to talk about is traditionally we would teach skills and knowledge in our how to respond to crisis behaviours or inappropriate behaviours if we haven't even got to that stage, and we would train on skills and understanding and equip people to develop those, to use those skills effectively. And if we look at the other end of that scale, well, what we really need is a mindset shift. What we need is the increase in self-reflection, that ability to really recognize the value of this culture shift. And so what we do at CPI is very much join the two. We still have this very robust training around how to respond in a reasonable and proportionate way to crisis behaviors. But alongside that, we also have this influence around how to change mindset, because that's actually a harder one to do. Because we're looking at behaviors, adult behaviors, organizational behaviors that are historic, the hierarchical approach of adults and young people, and if that exist in society for decades, centuries. And I'm not saying I'm anti-hierarchy, but when it comes to behavior in schools, I'm not sure young people need a reminder of status or hierarchy. I'm not sure young people need to be told your email signature or your job title. What they need is another human being next to them. And so some of the behaviors, the cultures of school behavior response that we've had in place historically, maybe we do need to reflect on them. Why do we do those things? Why do we have that in place? And if the answer is because we've always done it, or because it's the best we've got, then we need a better response. And so what we can do is start to develop the CPI suite of education training programs that starts at looking at classroom cultures, that we're not even touching crisis response at this stage. We're looking at how to use those 5 principles and support schools, whether it's an individual teacher or practitioner or a whole school culture. How do we create that sense of culture of this is how we do it, through visible and audible consistencies? So I've mentioned audible consistencies, things like the rules of your school. How consistent are you on the rules of your school? Does everyone know what the rules are? And in the schools that I visit, lots of schools have lots of rules. And when I ask the students what are the rules, they don't know the rules. They might know 3 or 4. They might know there's something like kind hands, kind feet, respect yourself. But then I ask the adults, and many adults don't know the rules. So already at something as fundamental as the rules and expectations and code of conduct, if you like, around the school culture, there's a blurring, there's a fuzziness because people don't know them. And so we need to simplify it. So out of the mouths of every adult come the rules in every behavior conversation. And we can only do that if we've simplified the practice. Then once we've built the foundation of that classroom culture, now we can start to look at verbal interventions that are built around de-escalation, that are built around adults and professionals taking some key responsibilities around how to influence a behavior incident for the better. And so we can start to try and reduce crisis behaviors and ultimately build towards this restraint reduction that we want to aim for. Because I've heard a term that the physical intervention sometimes has been described as positive handling. And I'm not sure anyone, and you know yourselves, if you've had to physically intervene, there's nothing positive about that experience. And so whilst we do need to have safety intervention training and support where those behaviors through trauma, through attachment, through adverse childhood experiences, all of the research is telling us where and you know these behaviors and where they come from in terms of what's influencing them. But ultimately, we need to make sure that all of that in place is built around the aim to reduce the need for using it. So we have to accept that some young people are at crisis points, and when you're at crisis point, what you need is support. And we need to have some sort of intervention that is safe and reasonable and proportionate in its entirety. But again, it's very easy to just focus on this end of the spectrum. And what I want to do is just broaden that. So we go back to that first, prevent and reduce, prevention being better than cure, like I mentioned, and the classroom culture, which is absolutely key. This is about building better relationships and sustaining those relationships. This is about modeling that accountability. Because if we have a policy that says this behavior equals this response, then we've got a danger there of not pushing accountability back to the adults. Because if I'm a professional and I say this behavior equals this response, well, it might have gone wrong, it might have escalated really badly, but I was just following the policy, I was just doing my job. In fact, I think we can be better than that as educators. What I would like to do is support every teacher to be able to understand that true value of taking responsibility for your behavior choices, being able to not aggress, because yes, you can be strict without being unkind. And yes, you can maintain boundaries and communicate expectations and correct young people's behavior without aggression. And so it's about really looking deeply in and thinking, where does that come from? My frustration, my fatigue, my annoyance, my irritation. Actually, as the professional, as the adult, I can be better than that. So we can reduce incidents and we can really have a positive behavior support around not just the high tariff behaviors, but across the board. CPI, I'm sure Fiona, stop me if you've already done this in my absence, but talked about the CPI as an organisation. So I'm going to skip through that, but I'm happy to answer questions if you've got some more questions. And again, these for the end, if you wanted to ask me directly about how we roll out their support, then that's also absolutely fine. But I don't want to repeat what Fiona might have talked about in the first portion of this. And so
Sure.
I think I've got pretty close to giving you 15 minutes of any questions that you may have for me. Anything from you guys?
Really well done, Ollie. Thank you very much. That was a lot of ground covered. Certainly we can see, I can hear just some of the consistencies that you're probably experiencing over there with what we're seeing here in the Australian education sector. Had a couple of good questions pop up along the way. How necessary and difficult have you guys found it to be to get the full staff on board with the shift in school culture? And I'll extend that with the difference between the teaching staff and the operational staff. Yeah. Sure.
It's not easy, especially if people are resistant to change, which we as human beings, as habitual creatures are. We like the certainty and the stability of our safety zone. We know where we are and we know where we stand, and that's where the consistency comes in play. Because we've got to recognize that just like young people crave consistency, so do we as professionals. And sometimes it's very easy to get stuck in the practice of, but we've always done it this way. Why should we change? I'm not bad at behavior management. I'm not a bad person. I'm not a bad professional. So why should I change? And that question of why is important. And so if we can build the culture of consistency that's clear, and we can support, as leaders in schools, we can support our staff in understanding the value of everyone being on the same page often is more important than individual practice. And so when we create that sense of consistency, it's not just about how an individual may respond, it's about that sense of connectedness. And your second point, Matt, about different types of staff and how they respond. Absolutely. I think teaching staff on the whole, perhaps in my experience, are sometimes better equipped or more able to make that shift happen. They've gone through perhaps, without wanting to generalize, a level of critical thinking as part of their training. And so they're able to critically reflect on their experience, and maybe other members of staff who may or may not have had that opportunity to go through that same level of self-reflection. Often approach behavior maybe more parentally, if that's where their background is. And so maybe if their job in a school maybe it's a lifestyle job. Maybe if we talk about teaching assistants or we talk about support staff, then what we need to do is recognize their need for support through this. This isn't about vilifying teachers or professionals. This is about suggesting that when we are all coming together and we are all on the same page, then we can truly make that cultural shift and support all of the young people through that safety and welfare and care and support that we need to put in place.
How I've got a piece of string question for you coming. I mean, what does a change structure like this look like? How long? If you've got the groundswell from the staff, you've got the leadership engaged, which is critical to top-down piece. What does a cultural shift in the education sector look like?
So you're absolutely right about the piece of string, but essentially it will take a lot longer than it takes if we just apply a punitive response to behavior. There's a time efficiency to, if I've got a room full of young people who are causing a noise and I bellow and roar and scream for silence, that is far more time efficient. However, I've got to do that again tomorrow, and I've got to do it again the next day, because I am teaching the young people that the only way they've got to self-regulate is when I lose my mind. When I'm intimidating and scary, that's when things get real. And so it may well feel time efficient in the short term, but nothing radically changes. And we're just constantly building our responses to behavior incidents, which is exhausting. And I work with lots of adults who are experiencing work-related stress and are off work because of their fatigue. And it all comes from not just behavior, but an exhaustion in the school culture of the way in which things are done, from the pressures, the stresses that are being placed upon individuals. And I think what we can do is, when we invest early on with time and energy and reflection and emotional currency, and we pay into that bank early on, then that investment is worth dividends and later on. And so it is the difference between me spending weeks, months, maybe even terms building that emotional currency and that emotional capital, because that's the difference between me just giving Matt a quick look in the corridor and a quick check-in, are you okay? And that's enough because we've got that connection, as opposed to not having that connection and Matt doesn't even notice the look that I give him in the corridor or in the classroom, and things escalate out of control and get to a point where they force us to have crisis response. And so I would say, change doesn't happen in a day. It doesn't happen in a week or a few months. We need to have that investment, and we need to have everyone on board. And so your previous question about getting people on board is essential, and it has to stem all the way through that hierarchical strand. Your middle leadership team are essential in getting this change happening. It's not just about the senior team agreeing that this is the direction we're going to take the school culture in. It's not just about the on the ground staff that say, yeah, we're up for this. We have to hold people to account, and sometimes those difficult conversations with colleagues often get avoided, because it's far easier to talk to a young person to tell them that their behavior needs to fix up, and they go, yes, sorry sir, I won't do it again sir, I'm absolutely on board. That's an easier conversation. But so often, and I'm sure the colleagues that are listening to this will have the same feeling, that you sit there sometimes and you're having that dialogue with a young person, and you're coaching them to become almost more emotionally resilient than the adult that's lost their mind and shouted and screamed and given them the hairdryer. And that doesn't feel fair. And so I think we do have to have those very difficult conversations with our colleagues. Sometimes they're our friends, but we need to hold them to account to say, this is what we've agreed. As a school culture, this is what we're doing. This is how we do it here. And I noticed that you are finding things difficult in your classroom. Can I help? And so it's not about pointing the finger and being accusatory, but it is about providing that support structure in place of how can we take everyone with us? How can we all walk and move in that same direction? So we are on the same page. So we are communicating those consistencies to our young people, but we're also celebrating it as colleagues.
You mentioned the concept of emotional currency, emotional capital before. Can you provide any examples or ideas around how a school can build emotional currency? So
for sure. First of all, I don't think I need to talk to the vast majority of educators about the value of relationships. I absolutely believe that the huge majority of educators and people who work in schools fundamentally get and appreciate the value of building positive relationships with young people. But things like just knowing their names, smiling on a regular basis in the corridors. And so just really basic stuff. What's important to them has to be important to me. So if I find out, Matt, your favorite basketball team, just finding a newspaper cutting over the weekend and saying, I saw this at the weekend, Matt, and I thought of you. Just having those moments that go beyond just my classroom. And when we look at the way society has shifted in terms of our approach to behavior over the years and our acceptance of adult behaviors and what's okay and what's not okay, we're moving to a point where young people are saying, you can't do that. I know you can't do that. You can't talk to me like that. And young people are developing a real understanding of their rights, more so perhaps than their responsibilities, but they understand what they're allowed to receive or not. And I think within that comes that shift that forces us to need to have those open conversations. And so I think, yes, it's about getting to know them, maybe having lunch, not the whole lunch, but just sitting down and saying, Fiona, do you mind if I join you? I've just got to have this sandwich. I've got you this afternoon, haven't I? I'm looking forward to it. Just those moments in the corridor, just saying, how's Nan? How are things at home? Just those conversations. And again, individualizing that for key learners. We can't be their friends, and nor should we, but we can be friendly. And so I think that warmth, that openness, that possibility for young people to come to us, every single young person in every school needs to have significant adults that they can name and they can turn to if they're in crisis, if they're in distress. And if they haven't got those significant adults because of the relational approach, then they're going to just push back and they're going to fight the system and they're going to try and break the system down because they feel let down by the adult world. And so if we go to those high tariff young people, the support that they need needs to be built on that emotional connection. And so I think instead of schools exclusively focus on what we do to build relationships, I think we need to turn the spotlight a little bit sometimes on what are we also doing that damage those relationships? Because for me, that doesn't make sense, right? Why would I as a professional build great relationships with my learners if the process almost encourages me to damage those relationships at the same time? There's a contradiction there in itself. And so what I want to do is really recognize what I do, what's in me that accidentally sabotages those relationships, because it's crazy to do both. So let's build great relationships. Let's pay into the bank with the emotional currency, but let's also make sure we are reducing, if not eliminating, the sabotage that we're doing to those relationships at the same time.
I've got a great one here. It's about emotional awareness in students and learners, and has the information age or technology and associated increase in emotional awareness. How is that shifting the readiness for schools to have a discussion around culture?
I think it frames the conversation, actually. I think you're absolutely right to identify a shift in emotional regulation or awareness or emotional literacy. But I don't think it's just about young people. I think technology affects all of us. We've all got a smartphone. We've all understand that the endorphins that are released when we get a like on a comment. We're all guilty of that, well, I say we all, I'm assuming there, I'm certainly guilty of it myself, of posting a status on Facebook and just checking back to see how many people have commented or liked. I mean, it's embarrassing. It's ridiculous that we feel this need to have this validation, but that's where it comes from. And I think if we understand as professionals that when I was at school, I didn't have a mobile phone, I didn't have the internet, I didn't have a computer. And so I've learned this and welcomed this technology into my life. The young people that I work with have been born into it. So they don't know any different. And I think it's very easy to say, well, you don't need a mobile phone. I didn't have one. So, I understand the value of not needing it. And I think rather than trying to layer an expectation on the young people of today with our experience and our models of the world of what it was once like, I think it's really important that we shift a little bit and recognize what their model of the world is. Young people communicate. I mean, you give them a mobile phone, you don't talk on a phone, right? You don't use a mobile phone for talking. A young person would look at you like you're insane if you suggested they make a phone call. And so the way in which young people communicate has shifted. And so, yes, of course, their emotional literacy changes and is impacted by that. but I don't think it's damaged or destroyed. It's just different. And I think we need to, as professionals, be better at understanding the world that they experience and how that informs their decision making. And how can we build that around the cultures of our school environments, rather than sort of going back to a bygone age that says, well, this is how school used to be, and this is how learning used to be, and this is how it should be. I'm not against traditional practice, but I'm also not against progressiveness. I think there's a healthy balance of the two. I think it's dangerous to have a binary either or approach. I think we can embrace traditional values as well as progressiveness.
Absolutely. And mindful, we've only got a few more minutes. A top three. What are the top three behaviours you would suggest the teaching group and the school operators should be in unison on? What behaviours would you suggest should be consistent across a school culture?
Okay, so I mean, clearly this is individual schools will have a variation and want to have specific adult consistencies for themselves, but very generically, I would say essential for adults to meet and greet. Essential for adults to be present at the school gates, at the front of the site, the SLT on the gates, teachers on the door of their classrooms, doing a proper meet and greet, a welcome that says, you belong here, I'm glad you've arrived. A smile, a compliment maybe, you're looking sharp, Matt. Fiona, you're looking ready to learn. You know, the sorts of things that says you are wanted. If I greet you with a frown or a screw face, or I don't want to repeat it yesterday, Matthew, then already I'm framing an unpleasant, sorry?
Have you been talking to my teachers?
Yeah, I've read your reports.
Getting a gauge of that, yeah.
And so that response frames quite a negative start, and I don't want to start the day with a negative. And so, yeah, an exceptional meet and greet. I would say an adult consistency, refuse to be aggressive in any way. It's not just about not shouting, because sometimes you've got to shout in the music room if you've got to talk over the tambourines, or on the sports field, you've got to raise your voice. If a child's about to jump out of the window, you're not going to want to whisper, can you not do that, please? So there's moments in a school that raising your voice has to be appropriate, but never aggressively. And so the second consistency I would like all schools to commit to is to refuse to aggress. And that includes looming over, invading personal space. It includes pointing, screw facing. I think we've got to really reflect on how we are perceived by our learners, not just how we intend. So meet and greet, refuse to aggress. And the third key adult consistency, I would just say smile. Just to communicate that positivity. Smile in abundance as often as possible, even when you're feeling like you don't want to smile. I think the contagiousness of warmth and love and kindness and nurture, I think, ripples through a school culture in a way that's immeasurable.
Very cool. No, that's there's a lot of that about the positivity in culture. We're seeing a lot of that, and that hard to smile sometimes. It's but it does flow on. So look, Ollie, that's all the main questions we had today. Everyone's hung on all the way through, so the content has clearly been relevant and gripping. Thank you so much on behalf of my partner Damien and I for joining us today, Fiona and Ollie. And certainly thank you to everyone for coming along and hearing a bit about how CPI approach culture and some of the stuff that's going on, not just in our market, but overseas. We will be happy to field any queries or questions you have as an outcome from today's session. We're happy to connect you with Ollie and Fiona to take your discussions further if relevant. But certainly we'll be making the recording available from today, and we'll be delighted to host a follow-up session if required. Ollie and Fiona, thank you so much. Ollie, you've got a quiet few hours ahead of you now before the work wakes up over there. Please do get in touch, everyone. And thank you very much for coming along today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. See you later.